Yeah, shall we start? Probably there might be some more people coming. I presume that everybody can hear us. Okay, a very warm welcome to everyone. We're really delighted to be hosting this webinar. The seminar has been organised by our Climate Declaration, and we have arranged for Chris Watson, the author of Beyond Flying, Rethinking Air Travel in a Globally Connected World, to host Robert on the challenge of aviation and shipping emissions. Chris, after growing up in an airline family, getting his private pilot license and flying for his business, drastically reduced his flying upon learning about the climate impacts. In 2014, he produced his book, Beyond Flying. The format of the evening will be Robert speaking for 30 to 40 minutes, followed by up to half an hour of questions. Listeners will note that our climate declaration has shifted to Substack, and our latest newsletter is posted there. Please feel free to comment on the Substack and share with friends. This webinar will be recorded and also posted there alongside others. Please go there and explore afterwards. Now, over to Chris. Welcome, Chris, and you'll introduce Robert.
Yes, thanks, Paul. It's my pleasure to introduce Robert from Massey University to present to us tonight. And I'll pass over to you, Robert, to tell us all about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, thanks for the invitation, Paul. And it's nice to meet you, Chris. I'm ashamed to say I hadn't read your book until a week ago. But I had heard about it for a long time, and I shouldn't have put it off so long, and I would recommend it to everyone. So, look, I put these pictures on the front page here because these were two of my early readers when I was learning to read in the late 60s. The one on the left of the New Zealand book, early reader series called Grandma's Visit. There she is. Grandma is in the Viscount, said Bill. And we all knew about the Viscount and the friendship, and we were all little budding plane spotters in those days. It had a great influence on me. And the other one, You Will Go to the Moon. I must have read that so many times. But of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we know how it turned out. I didn't go to the moon. Actually, nobody did. So that one was a lot of nonsense. But the plane one, of course, has just taken over the whole world and has now become a major problem. But I guess these pictures make me reflect that it's really the social aspects that are perhaps the most important in this issue rather than the more technological or engineering aspects. So I'm going to try and blend those in together if I can. Here we go. So I'm going to go right back to 1860. So this is the annual arrivals to New Zealand since 1860. And you see it didn't really increase at first. In fact, if anything, it had long periods of decreasing in the first century of colonization. And the changes here are much more due to social changes. So this was the gold rush and the Fogel scheme, and then a big depression in the 1880s, 90s.
Could I ask,
World Wars.
Robert, am I the only one who can't see the images?
I don't know.
Because I can't.
Can anyone else see the slides?
Okay, it's my problem. Sorry to interrupt, but I did just want to check with that. I'll sort it out. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay. So during this time, there was a lot of technological change. The ships improved enormously and canals were built, Panama Canal and so on. But that didn't lead to, we only really got this massive increase in travel, 100,000 per year, 1 million per year, up to 7 million per year in the post-war era and more recently. And also look at the red line is New Zealanders arriving home after a trip, and the green line is visitors arriving for a holiday, and they just track absolutely in lockstep all the way. So they're almost equal. There are slightly more visitors than New Zealand travelers, but they're both very significant. So New Zealand is wanting to have holidays, and tourists coming here, which of course is a major economic sector, they're both very important. And these events here, which seemed like they would be real turning points, they're now a long time in the past. The older listeners will probably remember this when Air New Zealand started their flights to London via Los Angeles, and what a big deal it was, and That's ages ago. We were right back at 1 million visitors, and now we're at 7 million. So since that time, in the last 40 years, there's just been enormous social change. So here we see annual arrivals just since 1990. So if we're following the science, we should follow the UNFCCC, and we should be looking at emissions since 1990 as the baseline. So the traffic's gone up by a factor of 4, and the fuel use and emissions has gone up by a factor of 3. So there has been some improvement in efficiency, but not enough to swamp the enormous increase in travel. Big dip here due to COVID, and we're almost but not quite back to pre-COVID levels. This enormous increase here, which I don't believe anyone had really anticipated or planned for, but this was really a lot more airlines coming in, especially from East Asia, China and other parts of East Asia. There was a lot of unrest about over-tourism at that time, which is still a problem. So here are the numbers. Aviation, 5.2 million tonnes a year, shipping 4.3. So together, it's 28% of fossil fuel use. It's quite a big chunk, and hardly anybody is looking at it. And that's why I'm looking at it, because nobody else is doing it. And the whole area is just very, very under-examined and under-regulated. This enormous growth was only possible because of the privilege given to that sector. The fuel use is not taxed and has almost no regulation or limits as to its environmental impact. That's actually for the international aviation and shipping, that's only half of it, because that's only the outgoing transport. So you could double those figures if you wanted. So all of this has to go to 0 by 2050 for 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is written into the New Zealand's climate law, or maybe by the mid-2060s for well below 2 degrees C. So there's only really a few decades left. It looks like quite a challenge, right? The second aspect of aviation is it's extremely unequally distributed. So this is some preliminary results from a survey we did of people in Queenstown Lakes and Central Otago district. Like you sometimes hear that frequent flying is the preserve of the ultra-rich or the 1%ers or something, but in New Zealand, that's not really the case, at least according to this survey. It's really the top third of frequent flyers who are doing a great deal of international travel. You've got the bottom third who don't do any international travel at all, the middle third who might do a trip to Australia occasionally, and then there's a lot of frequent flyers. There's a lot of people going to Europe or America or East Asia every year, and that's too much. So the inequality between countries and within countries is another very important aspect. So there you see protest group Climate Liberation Aotearoa protesting at a cruise ship. They were greeting the passengers as they came off the ship and asked them what they thought about climate change. So if you look in the official reports on this issue for aviation, you will see a lot of graphs like this. So the whole industry came under a lot of pressure because of its, because of just what I said basically, and the flight shame movement, among other things, Greta Thunberg. So the response was to adopt this net zero 2050 target. So first, the individual airlines like Air New Zealand said, yep, we're on board for net zero 2050. Then all the airlines together through their global body did that. And then the UN aviation body. So everyone's on board officially for net zero 2050. And there's whole stacks of lengthy technical reports about how that's going to happen. So here you see traffic growth going up. And the blue lines are efficiency improvements due to more efficient planes. The red lines, the red bit is electric and hydrogen aircraft. The yellow one there is fully synthetic jet fuel made from basically electricity and captured carbon dioxide. And then you have some biofuel and then a tiny bit of offsetting. So you'll see many charts like this. However, you could criticize that and say the whole thing is just completely delusional. That would be another way of looking at it, because all of those, each of those supposed innovations and improvements, extremely difficult to assess what might be the odds of them actually coming about and how much investment it would need to make them come about. Can they work? How much would they cost? How fast could they spread around the world? I think And also, what are the political changes and regulations that you would need to make any of this happen at all? All of those more difficult questions are basically ignored. It's pretty close to sort of a magic wand that people are waving when they show this kind of chart. But of course, in the media, you would get a quite different version. You would see, electric planes and hydrogen planes and all sorts of other wonderful things. So this makes it very difficult the dominance of this kind of preferred framing of the whole issue in terms of developing better new technology really skews the whole thing and distracts the public and the regulators and makes it impossible to assess. But either way you look at it, the projected enormous growth in traffic makes it very much harder to get to the net zero target. Instead, in the media, this is what you see. I just picked one that I saw a couple of days ago on LinkedIn. Gary Friedman, he lives in Christchurch, I believe, and he's got an electric aircraft. I think it's, well, there are now 2 electric aircraft in the country because New Zealand's got a little one too. And he says, a commenter said, "I'm not sure anything really captures the future of aviation more than this incredible photo." So this is the Corfi solar farm that's under construction at Christchurch Airport. And the original idea was that they would use the solar electricity there to make hydrogen, and that would fuel first hydrogen trucks and then planes. But of course, they can't really lose with the solar farm because they can just sell the electricity to the grid and still make a profit anyway. And Claire Waghorn, who was the sustainability director at Christchurch Airport, she said, "My new favorite photo." So that's just one example, but it's just a blizzard of distraction and confusion out there in the public sphere. And I believe that is a major problem as well. Almost everything you read, basically, you could compile a huge archive. Every single thing you read about aviation emissions in the mass media is very, very skewed and selective. So just looking at one of them, most of the airlines and governments are very strongly focused on alternative aviation fuels. So here are some examples. You can make them from beef tallow and used cooking oil, which there's not enough of that. You do get a big greenhouse gas reduction, but only if you count the beef tallow as zero emission, because all of the emissions of the cows are allocated to the meat, for example, and not to the other products that you make out of it. So details about the greenhouse gas accounting come in. This was in the news again this week because companies in Brazil were found to have been growing cattle on land in illegally cleared Amazon rainforest and selling the tallow to the US, who are making it into jet fuel. So all sorts of issues like that come in. You can make fuel out of grain like canola oil, but then there's another problem because that's going to displace food. You could try and make it out of wood, but there's a stack of reports just from New Zealand alone about how you might possibly make fuel out of wood. I mean, it's certainly full of energy, but it's full of, unfortunately, it's in the wrong form and it's full of other stuff as well. And there's only one operating wood to fuel plant in the world. And there are so many people have tried to do this and their plants have fallen over. But that's highly problematic as well. And then you have the e-fuel, where you make green hydrogen from your renewable electricity, capture carbon dioxide from the air or from a fossil fuel plant, and process it into fuel, which you can do. It's just very expensive and it uses eye-watering amounts of electricity because it's very, very energy intensive. So currently it has grown, but it's very, very small. And these pledges from the airlines to reach 10% by 2030, at the moment, it's hard to see that coming about. Yeah, but that's the main thing. That's the mainstream approach. And so most airline routes in the whole world are now covered by some form of regulation about aviation fuel, but the devil is in the details, whether those regulations are actually any good and whether they're actually helping or hurting. And the scale of the amount of fuel you need is enormous. So I saw one report that the EU, if we forget about the ones made from food or waste, because they're problematic, the EU could produce enough wood and e-fuels for New Zealand by 2035. But the EU is, their economy is 100 times bigger. So the scale of the problem is just enormous. And if you want to make it here to become energy self-sufficient, we could turn all of our land that's currently used for grain, process that all into jet fuel. Wouldn't really be a drop in the bucket, and now we'd have to get all the grain from somewhere else. So we haven't really solved the problem. So basically, there's a resource problem. If you're switching from fossil to some other resource, you're going to need a very great deal of it because it's just very, very energy intensive. So instead of going through the technology in more detail like this, I want to step back a bit and look at what I'm calling 5 dimensions of political ecology. Because I would like, I see so many of these articles in the media and elsewhere, and I'm always asking myself, where is this person really coming from? What's their environmental philosophy, for example? So the first one here I've called the growth axis. So we've got business as usual on the right. So just go for unlimited growth, as much growth as you can get, get as many resources as you can, try and push all the costs onto the environment or onto other people. That's pretty much the system we're living under. And here we have limits to growth. So, of course, if you're aware of limits to growth, as I suspect our audience is, anything other than here is just completely delusional, right? But unfortunately, this is the world we're living in. So there's a difficult question about where you might be sitting on here. And regardless of that, you should at least tell people where you're sitting on here so that we know where you're coming from. So, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the UN thing, they would be somewhere over here on the right. The Zero Carbon Act is also somewhere over here on the right. It's very much organized around the standard business as usual model, but it's still a very good thing, right? That doesn't mean it was a bad idea. Could have been even better if we just got the trees into their own carbon basket. Then we would have really had a mechanism to really wind down fossil fuel use very rapidly. Unfortunately, we didn't get that, and now the front's fallen off somewhat, but it was still pretty good, still very good for the time. So here are 2 examples. Julian Allwood is an engineering professor at Cambridge. His solution is over here. Basically, human activities that don't have an already existing large-scale solution must be phased out. So that would include aviation and also a lot of other things. If some safe replacement comes along, then you can do that. Paul Peters, who is a tourism professor, who's focused on the aviation industry a lot. He did a large project for a sustainable tourism group. They said, okay, you want growth of tourism and you want to be sustainable. The only solution is to have very large amounts of e-fuel. And even then he had to cap long-haul travel, which is really where the bulk of the fuel use is coming from. Now, this itself is very controversial because the resources needed to build this stupendous amount of renewable electricity are very, very significant. And you're putting it all into this one sector, which is very privileged. Is that really a sensible idea? Second dimension is the scale axis. If you're proposing some kind of solution or strategy or way of looking at this issue, you should be clear what scale you're looking at. Like individuals, you might be talking about persuading people to fly less. Then you've got all the people who enable other people or cause other people to travel more, for example, by building a big conference center or organizing big sports leagues. The tourism operators try and make people try more. The airports are very committed to growth because they claim that the emissions from the aircraft are nothing to do with the airports. But of course, if you want to have growth of air travel, you have to grow the airports as well. So all these different groups all form a large part of a coupled system. All of those scales are really relevant to the issue, and all of them face big obstacles. So really it needs to be sort of a multi-level approach to try and attack all of those things. So for example, flying less and flight shame movement, that was very successful in 2018 and 2019, and I believe it may not have stopped that many people from flying, but it did wake the industry up and make them focus on this net zero 2050 goal. Offsetting and flight labeling, offsetting has fallen out of favor for obvious reasons, but certainly flight labeling, choose the lower emission flight if you're able to. That's a sort of an individual type approach. science-based targets. Air New Zealand was in the news for adopting a science-based target and then dropping it about 18 months later. And then at the large scale, we have the UN's, what they call the long-term aspirational goal, which is for net zero by 2050, and I'll talk more about that later. So dimension 3 is idealism. Are you more interested in ideals? For example, what are your ecological values? Are you interested in climate justice and inequality and things like that? Or are you only interested in whether you can actually achieve the thing that you're setting out to achieve? Are you more interested in being pragmatic? And to me, that's quite a significant split there. I guess there's no easy answer there, but again, you need them all. But I would just like, to me, it would be good if people would come clean or be more upfront about where they're coming from. Maybe everyone who writes these net zero 2050 reports should take one of those ecological values assessment tests where you're asked a lot of questions and you get your ecological philosophy rated on a scale. That would be very interesting. So, for example, biofuel has been adopted, and the mandates, maybe not because it's the best thing ever, but because it was the thing that was on the table and that countries were able to achieve. So you've now got EU and UK, for example, 10% by 2030 and I think 65% by 2050. They're really attempting to push for very large amounts of biofuel. On the other hand, a frequent flyer levy. So that's where you get supposedly get one free flight per year, and then you start to get tax, and then the tax doubles with every extra flight. This would be an attempt to have a more progressive solution. So the frequent flyers would be paying more. The truth axis. Now, this is a bit complicated because of course, there are enormous amounts of lies. So I've got a huge file because when I was focusing on the Terrace Airport proposal, collected a huge file of all the most outrageous greenwashing that came out of Christchurch Airport. Just ridiculous. I don't see how they could say any of that with a straight face. But anyway, and of course, on the other hand, most people would like to be on the side of truth. But the problem is there's this enormous grey area in the middle. And that is really what confounds everything. Oh yeah, I put Hart Aerospace here. So this was a startup from 2018, and Sounds Air in New Zealand said, oh, we'll buy some of your electric planes. Got a lot of positive press coverage. It's from Sweden. However, they scrapped that plane that you see there in the computer rendering, and they came up with another plane, which was now going to be partly electric and then have a fossil fuel backup. So like a serial hybrid, and then that's also now been scrapped, and it's now going to be a series hybrid. So 2 of these motors would be electric and 2 would be fossil fueled. But they still don't have a flight. They haven't made a test flight yet. And they've actually now abandoned Sweden, having taken a lot of government research funding, and they've moved to Los Angeles. So nothing you can really read from these startups can really be relied on, in my view. And there's no really rigorous way to assess them. And I put personal travel there as well, because where does that lie on this axis? Because a lot of people might have quite strong views about climate change and environmental issues, but still be unwilling to change their behavior to the degree required. So to me, the uncertainty is sort of unremovable, and that means you must have a fallback option. You can't just, otherwise you're just taking a big gamble with absolutely no alternative if it doesn't work out. And that is not normally done. And then the last one, I realized when I was typing up my slides, the socio-technical axis, this is not really an axis that you can slide along. So my metaphor has fallen over here. Sorry about that. This is really just 2 completely different ways of looking at the world. Technocratic view, we have techno-optimism. Everything will be solved with markets, and if the markets fail, we'll have some regulations to pull them into line. But over on the social axis here, it's a whole other world, right? It's all to do with power. As we've seen with the recent environmental changes in New Zealand, it's all to do with who has the power to do what they want, what institutions you form in order to exercise the power, and what are the social norms about how people behave, and how does the media influence their views. Just 2 completely different ways of looking at the world. And of course, when people put out policies or policy suggestions or analyses, usually it's all on this side. It's quite unusual to see a detailed analysis on this side. So, for example, we now have a pretty strong social norm for recycling. If you refuse to recycle and if you just dumped all your rubbish, you would be frowned upon. People would tell you off. But if you tell your friends you're having a holiday in Bali instead of the beach 20 kilometers away, you know, that you would not be criticized. Would be a very unusual person who would call you out for that. Just completely normal behavior. Who was showing leadership on the issue? If you think back, the second axis on scale from individual up to global, you really want to have some leadership in a pro-climate way at all of those scales. We don't really have that. Instead, we've just got lobbying behind the scenes. This came up a few years ago. I hadn't heard of Kylie Jenner. Someone's got their microphone on, by the way. Kylie Jenner, who was a pop star, she posted this photo. There she is hugging her boyfriend, and the caption said, "Your plane or mine." So they each have an enormous private jet. So but this time she misjudged the audience, and there was a huge backlash against this, and that led to really a global movement against private jets and attempting to regulate their travel. That's still continuing today. So there I put the question, should Kylie Jenner fly less? And again, some news from this week. Amsterdam, along with other Dutch cities, they have banned advertising for carbon-intensive activities like air travel and cruises and petrol cars. So that will do something. So,
even got mine turned on to that.
Sorry, someone's got their microphone on.
They used to run courses. They're not sure if they do now.
Can the host mute everybody else, please? Diana, I think you've got your microphone on.
Diana,
Yes.
he thinks you've got your microphone on.
Thank you. So, right, what are we going to do about it, and what have we done in New Zealand? If you can see the date down here, 1990, this was our first government report on climate change. It's like 40 pages long, and it's full of ideas for things we could do, almost none of which were done for a very long time. But here's what we do have. At least domestic aviation and shipping were in the ETS from 2010. So at the time, that was considered a bit of a win. However, is not actually going to really affect emissions at all. And currently, at the current price, that's putting $4 on a return domestic flight. So that's not really going to have any impact, nor is it going to fund any decarbonisation, which the government doesn't want to fund anyway. So pretty much we've got the status quo. There's no GST on international flights or international cruises. There's no fuel tax. There's no carbon tax. They're not in the carbon budgets, for example. It's all about growth. So the tourism strategy is all about growth. All the airports are doing massive expansions and planning for growth. The papers are full of just new flights being laid on all the time. However, Zero Carbon Act was a major change, and that set up this group, Sustainable Aviation Aotearoa. It was initially going to be an industry body and in the draft, and then that was changed to a public-private body. So some civil servants were added to that group. So that was considered a win. And there was, in the first emissions reduction plan, there was supposed to be a plan to decarbonise domestic aviation. And there was supposed to be an energy plan, which of course impacts aviation. And there was going to be this review of whether international aviation and shipping should come into the 2050 target. So in a sense, that was a loss because that should have really been in the Zero Carbon Act from the beginning. It's clearly, those emissions are clearly part of the temperature target of the Paris Agreement. So that was a loss, but at least we got this review. And then at COP26, we joined this group with other countries called the International Aviation Climate Ambition Coalition. So that's how things were ticking along then. But more recently, this review did happen. It was very sound, and they did advise that international aviation and shipping should come into the target and how that should be done. Sustainable Aviation Aotearoa, which was set up and did meet, but they never issued any work of any form. They've never done a report or any public statement or work plan or anything. And they started work on the State Action Plan, which is a document you passed to the UN, but in 2024, the new government's basically stopped that work. And as far as we know, that group, Sustainable Aviation, is completely moribund now. And then the second emission reduction plan, everything was dropped. That it said the government's role is to facilitate industry discussions through existing forums, blah, blah, blah. So they rejected that advice. So in terms of the future government could bring that into the target, but there's nothing left for the Climate Commission to do on that. There's also a whole stack of reports on alternative fuels, because periodically people get excited that New Zealand potentially has a lot of renewable energy resources, and they produce these reports, but clearly nothing is going to happen without a bit of government direction. So why did the government reject the Climate Change Commission's advice? They said these will continue to be addressed through global cooperation mechanisms. New Zealand actively participates in these efforts through the International Maritime Organization and the International Civil Aviation Organization, blah, 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 going for growth, provides ongoing policy certainty for the shipping and aviation sector that IMO and ICAO will continue to manage mitigation of emissions in the sector. Now, the trouble is that ICAO does not manage mitigation of emissions in the sector. ICAO has always said that that is the responsibility of the states. In fact, we promised to submit a plan to ICAO how we were going to achieve net zero aviation by 2050, and we haven't written that report yet, just pretending the whole problem doesn't exist. So that is one problem. But the more serious problem is that New Zealand is actually obstructing the work of these bodies. We're no longer part of this International Aviation Climate Ambition Coalition, as far as I can tell. We've abstained on the critical votes at the IMO. So I'm be very skeptical that anything positive is going to come out of this. This is just a big dodge. So what I think we should do is definitely bring them into the target, 2050 target, bring them into the carbon budgets, bring them into the Paris Agreement commitment. We should not be expanding airport capacity. That's just creating lock-in and flight dependency. Auckland Airport is spending 4 billion, I think it might even be more than 4 billion, expanding their terminal and the whole area around it. The Terrace Airport proposal, it's officially on hold, but Queenstown Airport's traffic is growing rapidly, so who knows if that will come back. And if we want to work internationally, which we should, of course, we should genuinely support the progressive faction trying to get something happening there. And crucially, the crucial missing ingredient is leadership at all levels, rather than just deferring the problem. And for what it's worth, here's my own personal proposal. I'm saying, okay, you say you want to get to net zero by 2050, then that's fine. You work out how to do it, and I'll charge you $100 per tonne below that. That's just for equity, because why should the person who doesn't own a car and has to take the intercity bus, why should they pay GST and fuel tax and the ETS charge, while the rich person flying overseas for a holiday, they don't pay any of those things? So there really should be at least a level playing field. And then above the agreed cap, you should pay a much higher charge, and that money, it would have some effect on demand, of course. It would make tickets more expensive, but also that revenue could then be used to decarbonize other sectors where it's more technically possible. And if this figure looks ridiculous to you, this is the kind of penalties that are in play in the UK and EU for their aviation fuel policies. When they put a regulation in saying you have to achieve this target, the penalties for not meeting it are very severe. So that is a standard policy type thing that you could do. However, I don't believe there is a really practical engineering type solution to actually truly get to net zero. So there will have to be less flying if you want to achieve that. Okay, I think that's the end. There we go. Oh yes, so some of what I've said there about what's happening in New Zealand is in this recent report by Paul Callister and myself. and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Robert. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. That was very interesting and informative. I much appreciate that. Now, I've got a few questions here myself, and I'm just working from a cell phone, so I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to see questions from the audience, but maybe if I make a start, and if there are any questions from the audience, perhaps Paul could somehow let me know that, and I'll try to convey those through to you.
Sure.
So, a few months ago, I saw a report where the government was promoting tourism to New Zealand from about 5 different markets around the world. So they're actually trying to encourage it because they believe it brings in substantial overseas funds. What would your advice be to them if they came and asked you about, what do we do? We've got all these people willing to come and visit New Zealand and bring in their money. How should we promote to them, or what should we do? What would your advice be?
Yeah, so under the previous government, there was this Tourism and Environment Task Force with industry and government people, and that was one of the things they were looking at was not to advertise in the distant markets. So the government is spending Tourism New Zealand gets $100 million a year to promote New Zealand as a destination. So that could go to much more nearby destinations like Australia, rather than to the very furthest destinations. That would be one thing that you could do. But you also, it's very hard with the way the economy is structured. It's very hard to see a solution that doesn't involve pricing. So the UK, for example, does have this air passenger duty departure tax. So $200 for a long haul flight, or $2,000 for a private jet per passenger. So that is at least something that has been done and would have some effect.
Okay, and at a more local scale, councils, believe are mandated by the government to promote their economies, and one of the ways they do this is to encourage Kiwis to visit other towns. So Auckland is to Wellington, Wellington to Auckland, for example, to go to various events and visit their exhibition halls and things. What would your advice be to government on this issue if they asked you?
So yeah, there's a lot of the other aspect to that is a lot of the airports are state owned, either by the local council or the regional council. And we have this tradition now of them operating at arm's length, and they're very determined to go for growth. So there's an alignment there between the council wanting growth and the airport, which they own, also wanting growth. But then you also have cities with climate targets. And in the case of Christchurch Climate Plan, for example, that includes the emissions from the international aviation at Christchurch Airport. So they are at least looking at it. And in the debate over Terrace Airport, our group who was opposing that did meet with the Christchurch Council, and sometime later, I don't know if it was because of that, but sometime later, the council wrote a very stern letter to the holding company, and shortly after that, the project was stopped. So the local council's climate plans have to align in some way with their business plans. One thing they could do that's I know at least some individual councillors have been looking at is to have a departure charge, like $10 or $20 departure charge. Councils are strapped for cash. I don't believe $10 or $20 would have a very significant effect on demand, but it would at least send a signal, and it would raise funds.
Do you think they could just make their own cities more attractive so that people didn't leave them? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing of people traveling so much, that's the social trend. The people living in Auckland and having a batch in Queenstown, that's a very large trend that really, or even living in Australia and having a batch in Queenstown, that's just a very large trend that's a little bit hard to fight. Yes, I'm in Palmerston North, and there's I read a memoir from someone who grew up here in the 70s, and they used to have their family holidays in Sanson, which is a little farming settlement about 10 kilometers away. And that's how people lived just one generation ago.
Yeah. So much of our collective wealth comes from shipping logs and meat and fruit and milk and other primary produce, and I guess mostly in containers, but a lot of it in containers, logs on log ships and so on. What would your advice be to those industries or to the primary sector?
So shipping is actually easier technically than aviation. And as an industry, it's politically easier to deal with. Not to say it's easy. So a lot of international shipping is just moving fossil fuels around. So we wouldn't need that anymore if we phased that out. The ships can travel slower if we're not just held to leather speed all the time. That also saves a lot. And they have some other technical options, like you can have methanol powered ships, which doesn't work for planes because it doesn't have very good energy density, but it does work for ships. And so Methanex with their methanol plant, they already have methanol powered ships that visit Taranaki. So you could potentially have low carbon methanol. Or the other big thing is politically, you're only dealing with a few large shipping companies. So it just seems like you're not dealing with the social norms of your middle classes, which is the problem with aviation. So I think that is slightly easier to handle, and also it's much more valuable. So I showed that aviation and shipping are roughly equal in size in New Zealand, but the shipping sector is far more economically valuable to the economy than the aviation sector.
Yeah, well, I guess not half, but a substantial portion of international tourism is actually outbound. So it's actually a net loss to the economy. So,
that's right. Well, this is what was found during COVID. The tourist industry managed during COVID because everybody had holidays in New Zealand instead. And exactly. This is not entirely clear whether the tourist industry is a net positive for New Zealand.
Yeah, I believe it's as far as I know, it's a positive, but it's something like a third or a quarter of it is outbound. Okay, so just thinking more about the manufacturing sector, and because I've got a couple of friends in this area, and they export their products all over the world, and they also import components. So that's air freight, and also they travel extensively themselves to their markets, to their clients and so on, their buyers and industry bodies. So what would your advice be to such sectors of business who are, they're bringing in wealth to New Zealand and they're doing their jobs as best they can?
Well, if I put my limits to growth hat on, a lot of things are just simply unsustainable and cannot continue under any circumstances. So if something cannot be fixed and made sustainable, then we will have to stop. However, a lot of the growth in air freight is just due to completely stupid things like the ultra fast fashion movement, where you get all the clothes from China and they're delivered from China within 3 days or something, and then you throw them out and get another lot. All of that kind of thing is just completely ridiculous, and I just have to wonder how much of global air freight is actually like that. Some of the things New Zealand freights, like we used to air freight kiwi fruit, but eventually it was worked out how to preserve them well enough so that they could be sent by ship, which is of course much cheaper as well. So yeah, I would have to wonder the things that absolutely cannot go by ship. You have to wonder whether that is really sustainable at all.
Yeah. So what would be the mechanism for having whole industry review those requirements and look at alternatives? Would you suggest that be led by government in the ideal world?
As well, it's this multi-level thing. So yes, in an ideal world, the peak body of each industry should have some kind of credible net zero 2050 plan that they could defend. And if it's not going to stand up, then it has to be improved. That would be the ideal thing. But we're so far from that at the moment that it's very hard to see how we could get there.
Yeah. Paul,
So that's sort of why I hate to say it, but I sort of come back to market solutions, right? If there was a tax on jet fuel, which the European Union is progressively implementing, that at least would be something, and that would affect the investment decisions of people in that sort of business.
thank you, Robert. And I see Paul's just raised his hand on the screen. Do you have a question from the audience, Paul?
People could put something into the reactions, put their hand up if they'd like to ask a question. I would just like to mention we can. I actually travelled to South America about 4 or 5 times, and in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But I decided I didn't want to travel anymore by flying. However, in New Zealand, it is actually quite difficult to travel, and reduce your carbon footprint. But here in the North Island, the regional councils have actually got together and decided that they would improve the passenger rail between Palmerston and possibly further north. But we used to have a sleeper train, two trains a day between Auckland and Wellington, and there don't seem to be any proposal to reintroduce that. But we have 20,000 people flying in and out of Wellington every day, and I'm not sure what percentage of those go to Auckland, but I suspect it's probably about half. And I'm absolutely convinced that 1,000 or so at least would use a passenger train if it was made available, especially a sleeper train. But can you tell us how much progress is there any thing we can do to lobby more strongly government to reintroduce the passenger train between not a tourist train, but a regular passenger train with different classes between Auckland and Wellington?
Yeah, so we can all join this group. The Future is Rail, Save Our Trains, The Future is Rail. So they were formed about 5 years ago, I think, and exactly with this idea to rebuild and restore the passenger rail network. And they've produced a bunch of reports, and they've held conferences and done what lobbying they can. So that there is a movement to do that. And it is a bit sad, of course, when you read, like in Chris Watson's book, the Fly Less advocates in Europe are all singing the virtues of taking a train for 3 days across Europe. Well, of course, we just don't have that option if we want to go overseas. But even within Europe, that doesn't really solve the problem, because it's still a very long haul flying, which they're doing just as much in Europe as they are anywhere else. So basically, the flying is just so quick and convenient, and it's created this sort of flight dependency in the population that it's just a very normal thing to do frequently. So while it would be nice to have a train, it's probably not going to stop all of those people flying up and down between Auckland and Wellington. So the things that have actually caused change were, for example, the shift to working from home and the shift to Zoom meetings in the last few years. There was a very significant drop in petrol use because of working from home. It's actually starting to unwind a little bit now, but it was quite a large shift. It was like 15% drop in petrol use. So if you were looking for a solution, it has to be something that's big enough to tackle the whole problem.
You touched on the topic of offsetting earlier, and I'm aware that atmosphere.de is a popular carbon calculator offsetter. Are there some calculators and offsetters that are genuinely offsetting carbon emissions from travel or other types of emissions?
So that is quite interesting how in the last 5 or 6 years, belief in the value of offsetting has really completely decayed away, almost to nothing. So that was the industry and the media and the public, lots of people, airlines were pushing that for a long time. But I think because of work by activists about how pointless offsetting is and how it's not really a solution, I think that has had some effect, and that's one reason we don't hear about it anymore. The flight calculators are good, and the Google flight calculator is very good. So there you can, in fact, compare the emissions from the different airlines flying on different routes, because they do vary by quite a lot. So my suggestion to anyone who's flying is to use the calculator, and then or just look at the prices of your ticket and just make a donation to some kind of pro-climate group. That's likely to have much more effect than any kind of offsetting.
Okay, and just one final question. If one sees an object on one of these online shopping things, and say it weighs 1 kilogram and it's coming from China or North America, so across the Pacific, do you know how much a 1 kilogram parcel air freighted across the Pacific would change the climate in terms of CO2 equivalent?
I used to know, but I've forgotten. Is it about 10? Is it about 10 times the weight of the object in CO2? I can't actually remember it off the top of my head, but yeah, you can definitely look that up.
I guessed about 6 kilograms of CO2. Oh, no, sorry, it would be more. Yeah, it would be around 10 or so. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the audience? Oh,
Perhaps I'll ask another question. There's been a number of comments made about the bus stations, and one of the worst is in Taupo. That's a leading tourist destinations, but you get dumped off them. If you're taking the bus to Auckland, which I have in the recent years to see my daughter and granddaughter, the bus stops, a couple of hundred meters away from the toilet, and no shelter. I'm not. There's probably a few other examples like that, but I just don't understand why even the Taupo City Council doesn't, or town district council, why don't they see the importance of providing a decent
and why did Taupo Council put $10 million into an airport terminal upgrade when they only have like one flight a day? Because it's it's just completely outrageous. So you could say that the entire transport system is so out of whack that it's very hard to even think where you would start moving. But so the public intercity travel is absolutely dire. In fact, it's gotten worse, significantly worse over the past 10 years. There are a few regional public buses, like you can get a bus from Waikanae to Otaki, for example, but that regional bus network isn't integrated with the intercity bus network. So it's very difficult to even find out where you can in fact take a bus from A to B. It's really in a very sorry state.
So I urge people to ask a question, otherwise we'll conclude the meeting in a minute or so. Anybody else got a question for Robert or for Chris? Okay, hopefully this recording will be on our website, and please share that information with other people. It's a sort of available resource, and I think people should know about these questions. Hey, thank you very much, Robert, and thank you very much, Chris, as well, for being there and asking really great questions.
Thank
you. Okay.
Very good.
I think we'll probably end. Any final points, Robert or Chris?
That's all. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Robert.
And let's catch up sometime, Chris, when you're next in Palmerston North.
Yep, sure.
Bye-bye.
Neat. Right, okay. Cheers.
Thanks, Paul.